Hello, good morning. This is Jackie Shullerman with Global Banker here in downtown Palo Alto, and I am with Galia Schmidt with the Aharoni Business Law, and she owns her own practice. So, Galia, welcome, and we're so excited to hear what you have to say with regards to the limited liability companies (LLC) and how that usually is put into practice. So, tell me, what is LLC and when do you put those into motion?
Perfect. Yeah, thank you, Jackie. I'm super excited to be here talking to you. So, thank you for inviting me, first of all. Yeah, so LLCs and limited liability are one of the main things we help people with at my firm. And I thought it might be something that your followers and your clients might benefit from hearing about. So, kind of the very first thing I always start with when I'm talking about this is before we even get to LLCs is what is limited liability itself. So that's kind of question number one. So I usually try to start with actually what happens if you don't have limited liability. So if you don't have limited liability and you're doing something in business, then and you get sued for something that happened in the business or related to the business, then the person suing you can come after all of your personal assets, anything you own. So if you own a house or anything you have in the bank or your car, or if you're married, any community property you have with your spouse too. So it can be a really big deal. And if you have limited liability through a company like an LLC or a corporation, then that means that if the company gets sued, the person suing you, if you're running the company well, can only go after the assets of the company and not your personal assets. So it really shields your personal assets a lot, which is a really big deal, right? So question number one is we try to help people figure out if they even need limited liability to begin with, right? So we always walk people through three different questions when we're trying to figure this out. So question number one is, what is the risk involved in what you're doing? If someone has a business and they're just developing websites for people and they work at home alone in their pajamas, the risk is going to be pretty low versus someone who owns a big property that they're renting out, or they're dealing with heavy machinery or food or children, or things where the risk is high or the number value could be really high if something goes wrong. So the higher the risk, the more we're going to want limited liability, of course. Step two is, what are your personal assets? So the more personal assets you have, the more you're going to want to protect them, right? So some people, even if there's some risk, are like, you know what, I don't have anything, so let them come after me, sue me, good luck to them. But sometimes it's the opposite. Even if there's low risk, they just got an inheritance, or they have a house, or their spouse has a lot of assets and it's community property. So the more personal assets we have, the more we're going to want limited liability. And over time, I've also learned to ask question three, which is, what's your comfort with risk? Because again, some people higher risk or higher assets, but they're like, I'm just going to hope that everything's fine and I'll deal with it if it's not. And some people are like, even if it's low risk, I'm going to sleep better at night if I have this. So that's a personal decision, but it's something that I think is a really important factor people don't usually talk about.
At what point do you think that people should consider creating LLC? I mean, is there like a certain asset
Mm.
amount that you need to protect it, or do I need to even include
Yeah,
LLC in my
right.
portfolio?
Right. It's a good question. And again, that's why I asked that third question, which is about personal comfort with risk, because for some people, they could be broke and still feel like it's worth it to have that. But some people are going to have a much higher threshold for what they're comfortable with. So I think if you have community property or a house or kids that you have a college fund and you're trying to protect that, those are all good signals that it might be a good time. But
Mhm.
it depends on all three of those things. What is the risk of what you're doing? How much do you have, and just how comfortable are you with the situation? And it's something that a lawyer can help you walk through. But a lot of it is kind of a personal decision based on how you feel. Yeah.
Yeah. What about if someone has multiple either investment properties or commercial properties or even different companies?
Hmm.
Do
Hmm.
they need to have LLC for each one of them?
So that's a good question. So before we even get to that, I can talk about if someone does seem like a good fit for limited liability, then we'll talk them through the different options of limited liability companies. So there are a few like corporations, but LLCs tend to be a good place to start, especially for rental properties, but also for other types of small businesses as well. So LLCs are handy because they tend to be a lot more flexible than corporations. They tend to be a little better tax wise, at least for small businesses. But the downside of an LLC is, first of all, in the state of California at least, there's a minimum $800 a year tax to the franchise tax board. So if you're doing something small, that might not be worth it. But if you're doing something bigger and you want that limited liability, it might be worth it. And then on top of that, you have to have separate bank accounts for every LLC. And there's just extra admin involved because you want to run it correctly and you want to run it as if it's its own business and not just an extension of you, because if you do get sued, that's really important. And then there's also just the extra admin of everything being in the LLC's name. So if we're setting up an LLC for someone who has a rental property, which I think is, your viewers are most likely to be interested in that, it's the same sort of thing. We're looking at whether it is going to help them protect their limited liability and whether it's worth it. So we're going to look at their risk. We'll look at their personal assets. We'll look at their risk tolerance. Even just a single LLC, if you have a single property, it might not be worth doing because, again, we've got the fees and we've got the admin, and some people just might not want to deal with that. But to answer your question, if you have more than one and you're thinking about setting up LLCs, there's actually multiple ways to do it. So you can have one LLC and multiple properties in it, or you can have one LLC per property, or some people even set up an LLC that's the owner of all of the separate LLCs for each property beneath it. So that's the most complex one. And there's pros and cons of each. So if you have one LLC with multiple properties in it, you're going to have less admin, which is great because you're only going to have one LLC. So there's one franchise tax board fee you're paying and one set of bank accounts, and the upkeep is going to be easier. But all of the assets belong to the LLC, including the other properties. So if one property has an issue and the company gets sued for property number one, then property number two is an asset of that same LLC. So property number two could be gone after in a lawsuit, even if the issue was with property number one. So for that reason, a lot of people like to have separate LLCs per property because that means property number one, if there's a lawsuit, they can only go after the assets of property number one's LLC and not property number two. But the flip side of that, of course, is now you've got franchise tax board fees for each LLC and your admin for each LLC and your bank accounts for each LLC. So that's where it can get more expensive and more complicated. So it depends on the situation of each person, but it's pretty common we see to have people have one LLC per property just to make sure they're all separate, because that's the point of having the LLC to begin with.
Right. So if you have LLC, do you still need to have insurance?
Yeah, I get that question a lot. And my answer is a resounding yes. Please always have insurance. And I'm sure you agree with me, Jackie, that the LLC is handy to protect your personal assets. But the insurance is your first line of defense. It's going to be, hopefully if something goes wrong, your insurance covers it and you don't have to even worry about the rest of the assets in the LLC. But I'm sure you've seen situations yourself where either insurance doesn't cover the thing or it covers a portion of it, and then you're on the hook for the rest of it. And that's when the limited liability becomes really important, because we want to make sure that, they're not coming after your personal assets. So I always recommend, talk to your realtor, talk to good brokers that you trust, and make sure you have really good insurance coverage on top of having an LLC, even if you have your limited liability in place.
Are there any implications on the taxes and the mortgages for when you have LLC?
Yeah, that's a big question. So there can be. So first, let's talk mortgage. So this is one of the biggest potential downsides of having an LLC. If you already own the property and it's in your personal name or yours plus someone else's, usually there'll be a provision in the mortgage that's the due on sale clause that says, as if you sell the property to anyone else, the entire mortgage is due, right? So even though it's you owning the LLC, a transfer of the property to the LLC can sometimes trigger that due on sale clause, which is obviously not something we want to have to deal with. So if you already own the property and then you form the LLC, check with your lender, see if that's, what would happen if you tried transferring it You might need to ask for a waiver of that. And occasionally, sometimes we see them trying to reissue a new mortgage with, maybe it'll have worse rates, or maybe they're going to try to give you some extra fees. So that is something, make sure you know that before you try transferring it over, because that can go really badly. If you don't have the property yet, because of that, it's a really good idea to have the LLC first and then buy the property, because then you can put it straight into the LLC and you don't have to worry about any of that stuff. And on the tax end, that's where I always recommend talking to a tax advisor anytime you're going to form any sort of entity, but we're talking about property ownership here. Before you put it into the LLC, just make sure you know that any possible tax implications and consequences. Another thing that comes up is sometimes transfer taxes can kick in depending on the situations. So that's why, it's a really good idea to also have your tax person be involved in this decision before you do it, because again, it depends very much on the situation, but we want to avoid any bad tax consequences to you if you're going to do this.
When I do deal with my client, I do see that they have either sometimes they put their properties in a trust or quite often LLC. Are there any benefits from one versus the other?
So the LLC is going to give you limited liability protection. A trust is not going to. So the main use of the trust is really more about estate planning. So if something happens to you, let's avoid the probate process. Let's make it as easy as possible to transfer from one place to another. It brings up a really good point too, that another person I think you should have on board in this decision is your estate planner if you have a trust set up, because the LLC can also be put into your trust. And so that's another thing that you're going to want to figure out in advance. But generally, property owned in a trust is still considered personal property that they can get access to it if you're sued. So it's often a good idea to have both, but they serve slightly different purposes.
What other areas that you practice on that the viewers should be aware of in case if they need your help?
Yeah, thanks for asking. So we do help people set up LLCs a lot, and it's what we love to do. So not just real property, but all sorts of businesses of every kind. And we kind of help with everything that small businesses need as they grow. So that includes things like formations, like we've been talking about, but also contracts with vendors or clients, also hiring employees for the first time or working with contractors. So that's something that can come up sometimes with rental properties. And also registering trademarks and other intellectual property issues. So kind of everything. We call ourselves outside general counsel for small businesses. So anything a small business might need, we can help with.
Great. Well, thank you, Galia. I know there's a lot more questions that the viewers are going to be reaching out to you for more clarification. What would be the best way for them to contact you?
Yeah, I think our website's probably the best place to go because they can get everything they need from there. So the website is aharonibusinesslaw.com. So that's AHARONI businesslaw.com. So from there, they can email us directly if they have questions. They can automatically book a meeting online if they want to do an intake and set up an appointment. But our social media is also there. So we do a lot of videos like you do, and we try to, educate people and give them resources. So our articles, our videos, everything is available there as well. And we also have a newsletter that people can sign up for once a month to keep up on changes in the law or be informed of new videos or articles or anything that we have going on. So that's where I recommend.
Right. And what is the best phone number and the email address for people to reach out over and beyond your website?
Sure. Yeah. So phone number 855-414-4529 is our main line. And the best email address is office@aharonibusinesslaw.com. If people don't want to remember that, you can get both of those on the website too. But those are all good ways to contact us.
Great. I really appreciate it. This was so valuable. And I know that I've learned so much and I'll be reaching out to you down the road.
Thank you so much,
Well,
Jackie.
thank you so much, Galia, and a really pleasure talking to you. And I really appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you.